Can you tell me what we're doing here?
So today we're out here supporting nurses, not just with a clap, but with actions of standing in solidarity with them, to say that we understand how hard they worked during the pandemic. We understand that there's a lot of them that's suffering from PTSD. And actually what the government needs to do is stop trying to build up this rhetoric that the nurses are asking for too much and get around the negotiating table and negotiate with them. Because the government failure to do that is actually, it's inappropriate, it's inhumane, and it doesn't show any kind of leadership at all. This didn't need to happen if the government got round the table. They did it in Scotland, they could have done it here in Westminster, but they chose not to.
The Tory Health Minister who was on broadcast this morning, she is a nurse and she's a member of the RCN but chose not to vote in it because she was worried it would put lives at risk. Do you think that's what these nurses are doing?
There's one thing about the nurses is they would not deliberately put lives at risk. I tell you who's putting lives at risk, and that's this government. There is a crisis at the moment with the ambulances. There's a crisis at the moment with the shortage. We've got 133,000 shortage. We've got a retention problem where nurses are not staying. There's nurses that are going to work in large supermarkets because they're being paid more. That's what's putting people at risk. Don't blame the nurses, blame the government. And the government needs to take full responsibility for that. And at the end of the day, all they had to do was get around the negotiating table and this would have been called off. Why didn't they do that? Because this is a deliberate ploy by this government, because they think that they can turn working class people against working class people. But the difference is this: people are understanding their power. They're understanding that actually we are the workers. We are the ones that need to support each other. You'll see here there's banners from RMT, ASLEF, all the different unions coming together to say we are the wealth creators of this country and we can do things differently. All that's needed is a political will.
Would you say this was part of the managed decline of the NHS?
I think this is part of the managed decline of our country. This government is managing the decline of our country in every single area, apart from a very few elite at the very top. That's why Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, said to us there's about over £6 billion in fraud during the pandemic, but we're not allowed to ask questions on that. He's going to write that off. That is like saying, you know, everybody else can suffer, but our very few friends at the very top, the top 1%, we're going to make sure they're well looked after. And it's about time people realise that there's more of us than there are of them, and we need to stand together in solidarity.
What do you say about nurses using food banks?
Oh my God, listen, I've heard stories, not just of nurses using food banks, baby banks as well, where they're needing to find something. I've heard stories of nurses having to eat the leftovers from patients because they're hungry. Now just imagine that you've got a loved one in hospital that's being cared for, looked after by a nurse, and then that nurse is also worried about where their next meal's going to come from. Honestly, it breaks my heart. I've been listening to story after story after story. Nurses having to pay for parking. So, you know, they're paying more for less, and then they've got to pay for parking because they're working unsociable hours. You know, they're having to pay, you know, for their food. They're having to pay, they just can't afford it. They can't afford to work as a nurse and live a decent life. How can we be the 6th largest economy in the world and think that's okay? Well, of course we've got to look after our nurses, because the nurses look after us. You know, it makes sense if you think about it. It's like, well, it's ridiculous to think anything else. Pay them well so we don't lose them. We're going to, honestly, in the next 5 years, we're going to have a serious crisis in the NHS because so many people are leaving.
Is the Labour Party doing enough to support the nurses?
I think the Labour Party, you know, could do more, but I think there's a video that came out today in regards to how the Labour Party is supporting the nurses. And yes, but we also have to remember that it's really important that the NHS has to be free at the point of need, and that means that we have to invest in the NHS. It takes investment, and people say, well, you know, it's never ending. Well, the NHS is there to look after people who are sick. As long as we're alive, we're going to need the NHS, and we're going to need to invest in the NHS. That's just a matter of fact. So let's think about how we do that going forward.
It's slightly different to your Shadow Health Secretary, who thinks that it might be time to privatise the NHS. You wouldn't agree with that viewpoint?
I think there was a bit of a muddle there where we're just kind to go back to sort of 1997, where I don't remember, there was a crisis like with knee operations, and so they would use the private sector, to do those operations to get the waiting list down. But I think what we have to understand now is that how we invest and save the NHS is to invest in the NHS and not in the private sector. So if we invest in the NHS, then that's more sustainable, and it means it will last longer than, you know, investing in the private sector and then the money's gone, it's disappeared down a hole. Let's invest in the NHS, then that means we're investing for the sustainability of the NHS.
That's great. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.